By July 13, 1943, after repelling Axis counterattacks in Gela sector, and straightening out the bulge created in the center of the American 7th Army's beachhead, the Allies were ready to move on to the next tactical objective of Operation Husky, breaking inland beyond the so-called Yellow Line, the objective line which marked a safe zone for the Allied Air Force, to put into operational use the newly occupied airfields in southern Sicily. From July 12, the 1st U.S. Air Force fighters began deploying on airfields near Gela, while at the same time, the 1st Royal Air Force's Spitfire squadrons landed on Pechino Airfield, and over the next few days, more and more fighter squadrons arrived at the island, allowing the Allies to gain complete air superiority over Sicily, as now, their fighters had no longer to fly from Malta and back. In the east, the advance of the British 8th Army against negligible resistance was so swift, with the only things holding them back were a relentless summer sun, and a limited quantity of supplies, which had to be unloaded directly on the landing beaches, and transported to the troops by the poor road network. The quick advance in the British sector and a lack of any significant resistance made Montgomery overly optimistic, to such an extent that he made a decision, widely considered controversial. Given that Operation Husky did not provide detailed instructions to Army commanders once a solid beachhead was secured, except loosely defined strategy, which called for the American forces to shield a left flank of the British advance towards Catania, and further to Messina through the shortest way along the east coast, aiming to prevent the evacuation of the Axis forces across the Straits of Messina, put both Allied commanders in a position to take the initiative, and develop their operations independently. Therefore, Montgomery, who considered from the start the operation on Sicily as his private enterprise, on the evening of July 12, informed the 15th Army Group Commander, General Alexander, that he decided to seize the opportunity presented to him, after resistance across the center of the 8th Army's front unexpectedly crumbled, and that he ad hoc prepared a new plan, convinced that he has a chance to achieve a quick and decisive victory in Sicily, in a matter of days. So, instead of proceeding towards Catania along the east coast with the bulk of the 8th Army, and leaving advance northwest to Americans, he intended to divide his force, and bypass Mount Etna from both sides to take Messina, the ultimate objective of Operation Husky, solely with the British troops. According to his new daring plan, the 13th Corps was to continue its advance up Catania Plains, while the 30th Corps was to move quickly through a gap in the Axis line, and swing around the western slopes of Mount Etna, to cut Sicily in half, and proceed to Messina from the north, aiming to trap German and Italian troops positioned in the west of the island, as well as the ones blocking his way to Catania. The only way to achieve this was to advance with the 30th Corps along Highway 124, a road which marked the boundary between the 8th and 7th Armies, and was within the American 45th Division's zone of operation, and was a path they had planned to use. Not only was Highway 124 to fall into British hands, but Montgomery's plan also included a unique task for the American 7th Army, which could best be summarized as, "Stand aside and don't disturb." Alexander, who so far in the campaign did not interfere in the decisions nor provide any guidance to his army commanders, on July 13, approved Montgomery's plan, believing that the British troops were more reliable and experienced than the Americans. On that same day, he visited Paton at the 7th Army's headquarters, to inform him about Montgomery's plan, and instruct him about his new task, relegating the 7th Army's role in the campaign to merely holding already taken ground and protecting occupied airfields, justifying this decision with the lack of supplies and inadequate road network, which did not allow for two armies to both carry out extensive offensive operations simultaneously. Despite his enormous displeasure, Paton accepted Alexander's command, agreeing at the same time to hand over Highway 124 to British control. However, Paton did not intend to be merely a bystander for the rest of the campaign, so as soon as Alexander left his headquarters, he had already begun to consider other options for the 7th Army. After all, if Montgomery could set his own agenda, then so could he. And so, in the afternoon of July 13, to the American surprise, the lead elements of the 51st British Division, appeared on Highway 124, and began bumping into the men from the 45th Division, who advanced along the road on approaches to the mountain city of Vizzini, and to their even greater surprise, both divisions had the same task, to capture the town they expected to find undefended. Shortly after, the 45th Division received orders to pull back, almost all the way back to the invasion beaches to join the rest of the 7th Army, leaving the use of Highway 124, as well as the task of taking Vizzini to the British, and who were from there, to proceed further towards Caltagirone. However, instead of being abandoned, Vizzini, an important intersection of three major roads, that sits on a hill some 600 meters above sea level, was defended by the rearguard of the retreating Hermann Göring Division, and the approaches to Vizzini quickly became the scene of the desperate battle, which reminded the British that they were no longer in the open desert, but on the mountainous terrain which favored the defenders. Instead of taking Caltagirone on July 14, as Montgomery had planned, the British were stuck in front of Vizzini for 2 days, until it was finally taken in the early hours of July 15, and only after the Germans pulled back. Meanwhile, on the 8th Army's northern flank, the 13th Corps still struggled to push through Kampfgruppe Schmalz, the only Axis force which stood between the British and the virtually undefended city of Catania. Furthermore, to secure an undisrupted way to this vital port, once a breakthrough was achieved, the British had to overcome a major natural obstacle, the Simeto River, which lay some 10 kilometers south of Catania. The importance of the Primo Sole Bridge, which spans over the Simeto River, as well as having it seized before the Axis forces could destroy it, was recognized in the early stages of planning Operation Husky, and to accomplish this, under Montgomery's guidance, a separate plan was developed designated as Operation Fustian, which was to be the fourth and the final airborne operation of the invasion on Sicily, scheduled to begin on the night from 13th to 14th of July. The task of taking this gate to Catania, which lay on Highway 114, some 10 kilometers to the south of the city, was given to the 1st Parachute Brigade of the British 1st Airborne Division, under Brigadier Gerald Lathbury, and simultaneously with paratroopers, No. 3 Commando, was to take another bottleneck on Highway 114, the bridge at Malati, which spans the Lentini River about 5 kilometers north of Lentini. Once these forces secure these two bridges, the 50th Division, reinforced by the recently landed 4th Armored Brigade, would have to strike through the German line at Lentini, and race some 25 kilometers over the single road in less than 24 hours, to relieve the commandos first, and later the paratroopers at the Simeto, and establish a bridgehead north of the river by nightfall. If this plan sounds oddly familiar, it is because Montgomery will attempt to do it again, on a much grander scale, the following year in Holland. On the morning of July 13, the 50th Division launched an attack on Lentini, encountering much stronger resistance than expected, from the heavily entrenched Kampfgruppe Schmalz on the approaches to the town, which held them for 24 hours, bringing Montgomery's ambitious stroke to a rocky start. At the 50th Division's right flank, the 5th Division joined the battle during the day, but despite the determination of both of the 13th Corps divisions, and the intense fighting, it was not until the early afternoon of July 14 that the Germans finally withdrew from Lentini, using secondary roads to the northwest, in the move that brought Kampfgruppe Schmalz a little closer to the rest of its division. In the meantime, at about 10 p.m. on the night of July 13, No. 3 Commando disembarked from landing craft on the coast and moved inland to the Malati Bridge, expecting to find only demoralized Italian troops, but instead, from the moment they had landed until they reached the bridge at about 3 a.m. on July 14, the commandos have been engaged in continuous firefights against the elite German paratroopers and infantry from Hermann Göring Division. Still, once they eventually reached the bridge, they quickly seized it and removed the demolition charges. Unfortunately for the commandos, Highway 114 was equally as important to the Germans as it was to the British, since it was their main resupply line and primary evacuation route north, so they just could not let this vital lifeline fall into British hands, and thus, their reaction was predictable and relentless. As soon as commandos gained control over the bridge, the Germans quickly threw everything they could gather against a small British force, including one Tiger tank, and after holding out for the better part of July 14 and suffering heavy casualties, the surviving commandos finally dispersed into small groups, and fought their way back towards friendly lines. The commando action, however, was not in vain. Despite having suffered heavy casualties of 28 killed, 66 wounded and 59 missing, they had held the bridge long enough to prevent the hastily retreating Germans from destroying it before the arrival of the advancing units of the 50th Division, who, at about 5 p.m. on July 14, captured the Malati Bridge undamaged. The same night the commandos embarked on their daring action, Operation Husky began, and this one, like the previous three, would turn into another costly airborne fiasco of the Sicilian campaign, in which very little went according to plan. On the evening of July 13, the paratroopers of the 1st Parachute Brigade boarded their planes, and to avoid the same scenario which happened to the Americans during the disastrous Husky 2 mission, 2 days ago, their flight path from Tunisia to Sicily was to go around the Allied fleets. Nevertheless, as formation drew near to Sicily, they came under fire from both the Allied fleet and Axis shore batteries, which shot down a few C-47s, while the others lost navigation during their final approach to the target. As a result, out of the 116 aircraft which participated in Operation Husky, 26, almost a quarter of the entire force, returned to base in the face of heavy anti-aircraft fire, without having dropped any men at all. 11 C-47 transport planes were lost, some with paratroopers on board, while only 39 were able to drop paratroopers on, or close to the intended drop zones, with only about 200 of the 1,900 British paratroopers who jumped in the night, reached the Primo Sole Bridge during the night, while others became scattered all over Catania Plain, nowhere near their intended destination. Despite these difficulties, the small group of 50 paratroopers, who landed on their designated area, quickly gained control over the intact bridge, after completely surprising the 50-men-strong Italian Guard force. Throughout the night, more reinforcements arrived on the bridge, and by morning, some 120 men, from the 1st and 3rd Parachute Battalions, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Alistair Pearson, set up a defensive perimeter around the bridge, while at the same time, other small bands of paratroopers took defensive positions on some adjacent hills. As it turned out, taking the bridge was easy, but holding it was considerably harder. By daybreak, the Germans were well aware that the Primo Sole Bridge was in the British hands, and at about 6:30 a.m., the German paratroopers from the 1st Parachute Machine Gun Battalion, of the 1st German Parachute Division, who had landed the previous afternoon at Catania Airfield, and had taken up positions about 2 kilometers south of the Simeto River, to the west of Highway 114, began pounding the area with mortar and heavy machine gun fire. Shortly after, they had launched the first in the series of their attacks, in what became one of the rare battles, in which the German paratroopers had fought against the British. Throughout most of the day, the British paratroopers held off Axis attacks coming from both sides of the bridge, in a wild fight of small dispersed groups, in an area without a clear line, in which the Germans were free to disengage from combat at will, only to attack again from different directions. And, as the pressure became unbearable, casualties mounted while ammunition was running out, and with the 50th Division nowhere in sight, around 6:30 p.m., the British withdrew to defensive positions in the hills south of the bridge. Later that evening, leading elements of the British 4th Armoured Brigade, and infantry from the 69th Brigade of the 50th Division, made the first contact with the paratroopers, but having covered more than 25 kilometers in less than 2 days in continuous combat under the blazing sun, they were in no shape for offensive operations. In the early morning of the following day, on July 15, the 4th Armoured and 69th Infantry Brigades attacked the bridge, the defences of which had by this stage been reinforced by elements of the German 4th Parachute Regiment, and various Italian units that had come from Catania. During the next 2 days, a fierce battle raged that highly resembled those fought during the First World War, with British infantry charging over the open field with fixed bayonets. Nevertheless, Even in these conditions, and despite heavy casualties, on July 16, the 50th Division finally recaptured the Primo Sole Bridge. Still, by this time, the bridge had lost its value, as the Germans had withdrawn to a far more formidable defensive line, established on the approaches to Catania. By July 17, after 3 days of savage combat, the 50th Division ran out of steam at the Simeto River, while its 69th Brigade, which was at the heart of the battle, took the heaviest beating, having lost over 500 killed, wounded and missing. Out of a small British airborne force that took part in Operation Husky, many who remained scattered over Catania Plain got captured, while those who took part in the battles around the Primo Sole Bridge suffered at least 27 killed, while 88 were wounded or missing, and so since July 15, all further operations of the 1st Parachute Brigade on Sicily were suspended. And, while Montgomery's gamble slowly but steadily began to crumble, the Germans and Italians wasted no time strengthening their defenses. After having fought a long series of delaying actions against pursuing American and British units, on July 15, the bulk of Hermann Göring Division joined forces with Kampfgruppe Schmaltz in front of Catania, where they, reinforced by elements from the 1st Parachute Division and remnants of various other Italian units, regained their composure, and formed a defensive line on the northern bank of the Simeto River. To their right, remnants of the Livorno Division took the position along a new line, on the foothills of Mount Etna, while the 15th Panzergrenadier Division, which, by that time, had barely seen any combat, pulled back from western Sicily, and was now prepared to block the 30th Corps advance to the northwestern approaches of Mount Etna, and with that move, only the elements of Aosta and Assietta divisions remained to guard the western part of the island. Along with troops already on Sicily, the Germans rushed more and more reinforcements to the island, and in anticipation of an eventual evacuation effort, the additional heavy flak and coastal artillery units strengthened both sides of Messina Straits, under the command of Colonel Ernst Günther Bod, who had taken command of the city's garrison. Furthermore, as the German contingent increasingly grew in strength, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring ordered a transfer of the 14th Panzer Corps headquarters from Calabria on mainland Italy to Sicily, commanded by General Hans Valentin Huber, a veteran of the Russian campaign. Huber arrived in Sicily on July 15, where he met Gazzoni, only to inform him that he would remain in nominal command, but Huber, and the 14th Panzer Corps headquarters, would take over the actual and operational charge of the Axis troops on Sicily, with the clear task to evacuate as many German forces as possible for future operations. A few days later, on July 18, Kesselring, who had no longer faith in the Italian troops, finally persuaded Hitler to send the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division to Sicily, and although at first hesitant, Hitler, who considered it pointless to send another division on the island, only to be evacuated later, finally ordered the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division, then stationed in southern Italy, to reinforce the Axis troops on Sicily, and by July 25, the division finished its deployment along the northern coast. In parallel with the Axis defensive preparations, the 8th Army still struggled to carry out Montgomery's plan. While on the east, the advance of the 13th Corps was brought to a halt on Catania Plains, at the banks of the Simeto River, the 30th Corps resumed advance west along Highway 124, and this advance turned out to be two separate battles, fought by the 1st Canadian and the 51st Division, with neither supporting the other. On the morning of July 15, the 1st Canadian Division, which was after swift advance from the beach, held in reserve for the previous few days, moved through the line of the 51st Division, which advanced northward, while the Canadians proceeded the west along Highway 124, towards Caltagirone, with the objective of taking Enna, where they, in the streets of Gramicelle, a small town halfway from Vizzini to Caltagirone, walked into an ambush set by the rear guard of the retreating Hermann Göring Division. Following a fierce battle on the streets of Gramicelle, the Canadians had finally entered deserted Caltagirone, before daylight of July 16, and advancing further along Highway 124, the following day, they had reached Piazza Armerina, held by the 2nd Battalion of the 104th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, from the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division. For the next 24 hours, a single German battalion had held up the entire division, and had made good its escape, so it was not until noon of July 18, before the 1st Canadian Division could regroup, and resume its advance up Highway 124 towards Enna, where again, they met stiff resistance and were finally halted, by the bulk of the 15th Panzergrenadier Division. To their right, the 51st Division, with the 231st Brigade attached, advanced in the centre of the British front, aiming to maintain contact with the 13th Corps, but just like the Canadians, they were soon halted, in front of the village of Gerbini. By July 18, the 8th Army had become stretched to a limit, while its advance stalled along the entire front, and thus, Montgomery's efforts to score a decisive victory in a matter of days had come to nothing. His decision that, instead of launching a thrust towards Catania with both his corps, attempt a secondary drive with the 30th Corps via Highway 124, turned out to be a major misjudgment. Meanwhile, having had enough of sitting aside and watching the British take Sicily, on July 17, Paton visited Alexander, his headquarters in Tunisia, to persuade him that the best way to protect Montgomery's flank was to clear the entire west side of the island. During the heated discussion in a tense atmosphere, Alexander reluctantly agreed to Paton's proposal, despite his continued skepticism of American capabilities. Once Paton returned to Sicily, he wasted no time, eager to prove that Americans could go twice as fast as the British, and hit twice as hard. Therefore, Paton hastily prepared a plan for the 7th Army, which by that time, had plenty of time to rest, and to organize into a more regular army structure of 2 corps. According to this plan, a provisional corps, under Major General Geoffrey Keyes, the 7th Army's deputy commander, which consisted of the 3rd Infantry Division, the elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, the Ranger Battalions and the 2nd Armored Division, was to rush west towards their primary objective, Palermo, the biggest city in Sicily. Simultaneously, the 2nd Corps under General Omar Bradley, comprised of the 1st and 45th Divisions, was to advance up through the mountains into central Sicily, to serve as a flank guard to a provisional corps. In the morning of July 19, spearheaded by the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, the provisional corps began its race, and on the first day only, the paratroopers advanced 40 kilometers, in what the 82nd Airborne Division's commander, General Maxwell D. Taylor, later described as a pleasure march. It took 2 more days, before the paratroopers and Rangers cleared most of the island's western end, encountering only limited resistance. To their right, the 3rd Division, swiftly advanced on foot over rugged terrain, while the 2nd Armored Division, moving over the roads, made equally speedy progress, again against only a sporadic opposition, and by the night of July 22, both divisions were on the outskirts of Palermo, ready to attack the city. That, however, proved unnecessary, as that evening, General Giuseppe Molinero, who recognized the hopelessness of the situation, surrendered Palermo, and the city's garrison to General Keyes. The following day, Paton had his moment of glory when he, triumphantly entered Palermo, greeted by the cheering crowd. In only 5 days that took them to take Palermo, the Provisional Corps suffered only 272 casualties, while Italian casualties were about 2,900 killed or wounded, and more than 50,000 prisoners. In parallel with the race to Palermo, Bradley's 2nd Corps had also made a rapid advance, encountering though much stiffer resistance. On July 19, the 1st Division took Enna, held by the elements of the 15th Panzergrenadier Division, and in the following days, the 1st Division became involved in some sharp clashes, with the spearhead of the 29 Panzergrenadier Division, which forced the 1st Division, slowly to turn eastwards. The 45th Division, in the meantime, had advanced northwest, reaching the northern coast near Termini Imerese on July 23, completing by that the 7th Army's task. By that time, however, the opportunity to trap the Axis forces in the west, had long been gone, and instead of a swift victory, the campaign on Sicily, slowly became a war of attrition.